And we're back with Middle East now. The Biden administration is sending a missile destroyer and several fighter jets to the UAE. That obviously comes after several missile attacks from Yemen. Our correspondent Bastien Borie in Dubai. Good evening, Bastien.
Good evening, Jacob.
All right. What are the details of this move by the Biden administration?
Well, this shows that the United States is not only responding to the UAE's call for help and to the UAE's diplomatic pressure to step up the fight against the Houthis. It also shows that the US wants to respond to the last two attacks coming from Yemen. The first one having targeting an air base in Abu Dhabi, where Emirati but also American and French fighter jets are stationed, thus Western interests. And the second one having occurred during the visit of Yitzhak Herzog, President of Israel, an ally country. Moving on, another remark, the international military coalition fighting the Houthis in Yemen, as you know, is led by Saudi Arabia and includes all the Gulf monarchies, including the UAE, plus Egypt, Jordan, and Morocco. And it is seeking at all costs to leave this war, to withdraw from it without necessarily finding a political solution. It is a costly conflict, devastating in humanitarian terms, and it tarnishes the image of the countries involved. So we understand, we can see that the UAE, by asking for help, is also trying to transfer the burden and responsibility of resolving this issue, this Yemen issue, onto the United States. And the consequence is that, in turn, isolating the Houthis will be profitable for Iran, which has been given a free hand in Yemen. We see that, and which will be more than ever the only negotiating partner for the Houthis.
Yeah. So I want to ask you, Bastien, I keep asking people from Bahrain or the UAE about the tension, about things we haven't heard in years, all these military exercises, missiles, and cooperations around. And everybody keeps telling me, no, it's okay, it's not worrisome, it's fine, no danger, no fears. Is this a denial because it's bad for business or something, or is it really they're not under pressure now?
We're starting to hear more and more conversations, with the people you meet in the streets about these Yemen attacks, and people are really expecting the UAE and the US to put much more effort on targeting the Houthis. There is a very interesting diplomatic moment these days with the US considering to redesignate the Houthis as a terror group. Donald Trump had already put them on this list of terrorist organizations. A series of dozens of more or less radical groups such as Al-Qaeda, the Tamil Tigers, and so on are listed. And Joe Biden, only a few days after being invested as president, has removed them from it. Why? Well, I was able to talk to a source in Yemen who said that designating the Houthis as terrorists complicated the dialogue with them and made impossible a diplomatic settlement of this conflict, and made even impossible the delivery of food and medicines to civilians. So the UAE and the UAE population is pushing for the Houthis to be considered again as terrorist group, because these issues could re-emerge. And it is safe to say that Joe Biden will accept this pressure from the UAE and will do it. He's criticized for his management of the COVID crisis, for his lack of economic results. So he needs to score points, if you will, on the international scene. And this will be very profitable for the UAE, including the UAE population.
Yeah. Stay with us, Bastien. I'd like to bring in from Washington, Mr. Brian Katulis, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and Mr. Danny Citrinovich, formerly from IDF Intelligence. And I'd like to start with you, Mr. Katulis. It is a move by the Biden administration, but rather a small move, right?
Yeah, it's a fairly small move, but I think significant in the context of what's going on with Ukraine and Russia, as well as China. So I think it's an important move. The Biden administration came in with, I think, a bit of naivete about the Middle East, talked about ending the war in Yemen simply by appointing a diplomat. But the reality is that the complicated security scenario in the Middle East blows up, as we saw in the Gaza crisis of last year and as we're seeing right now. So I think even though it's a small shift, I think it's an important one in this context of an administration that really wanted to pivot to Asia and to China, and then is also dealing simultaneously with this big threat from Putin to Ukraine.
If we see deterioration and escalation, should we expect more American military force in the Gulf?
I think you should expect first an attempt to try to coordinate among our partners, America's partners in the region. You see this in the missile defense system that was activated and used in an integrated way. So I think the first step is that given all these other contingencies, and understand the Middle East is important, but we saw this in the Trump administration, we see it in the Biden administration, it's not as important in the U.S. strategic calculus as China and Russia. So working by, with, and through partners, I think will be the first step. I think we could see more military equipment and troops going to the region. But given these other contingencies and the strategic global implications that Russia and Ukraine might have, or China and Taiwan, it's just a delicate global balancing act that the United States is facing.
Right. Well, you know, the Middle East is not important until it gets important. That's
absolutely
usually what happens. Yeah. All right. Danny Citrinovich, I want to ask you, when they talk about defense cooperation agreement between Israel and Bahrain, what are we talking about?
Well, I think first we need to highlight the importance of Bahrain. I think that when people are talking about the importance of the Abraham Accord, they usually tend to speak about the relations between Israel and the UAE, and maybe forgetting a little bit about Bahrain. But Bahrain is extremely important from several reasons. I think that first and foremost is the fact that they really feel threatened by Iran, not only from the external issues, but also domestically. In Bahrain, there is a large Shia community, and in the past there were indications that Iran and Hezbollah trying to incite this population against the regime itself. So I think in that regard, I truly understand the jeopardy of that. And I think that Israel can really help in a way from the intelligence cooperation, but also the maritime issues that I think are crucial. I think that it's not surprising that the Navy commander, Admiral Salameh, joined Defense Minister Gantz, because I think that the maritime coordination, especially headed by the American Fifth Fleet, the station in Bahrain, can really help Bahrain to protect its maritime routes, but also some sort of protecting also Israeli movements in the Persian Gulf.
Mm-hmm. Brian, isn't this a chance for the United States to actually build now and lead a strong coalition here against Iran?
Oh, absolutely. But the challenge here is you have an administration that is very fixated on diplomacy in Vienna, to the detriment of actually what I think needs to be a more comprehensive strategy that is investing even more on deterrence of Iran and helping our partners defend themselves from what is essentially daily attacks. We do this from time to time, episodically, in places like Syria and Iraq when U.S. troops come under threat and attack. But unfortunately, we've had what I think, and this is common to the Trump administration and the Biden administration and Obama as well, a strategy that's largely one of passive appeasement. And though Trump did some things slightly differently, he also ignored entire attacks on places like Saudi Arabia and did nothing when this happened. So I think that mindset that stretches across now 3 U.S. administrations is still very much in place. And there's a dynamic, as I said before, of trying to get our regional partners to do more. So I think when we hear about Israeli and Bahraini cooperation or Israeli-Emirati security cooperation, it's sort of a breath of fresh air and maybe some opportunity to move from this model where it's not just on the U.S., but the U.S. should play an active role, in my view, a more active role in helping our partners become more integrated with themselves and defend themselves.
Bastien, in Dubai, let me get back to you. Are the Emiratis confident enough, would you say, that if they would need more help militarily from the United States, they would get it?
Oh, they will definitely get it, and they're also expecting more help from Israel, because we have to note that we often criticize the Israeli-Bahraini relation as being a relation that is lagging behind in comparison to what's happening between Israel and the Emirates. But we have to remember that the reason why Benny Gantz is in Bahrain today is to sign the first memorandum of understanding between Israel and a Gulf monarchy. Turkey. So it means it could come to the UAE someday. And by definition, even if it's not a deal, even if it's not a contract, even if we have to wait for companies of the military-industrial complex of the two countries to agree on the models of equipment as well as their assignments, it shows that in any case that Israel and the UAE and Bahrain have a common line of action against Tehran.
Yeah. Danny, back to the military issue on the Israeli side. Can this escalate to a full-blown Middle East war with Israel against Iran? Because as we speak, Israeli warplanes are exercising an attack on Iran.
Definitely it can, and the tension is really high. And I think it's not only the nuclear issue, but also the short of war campaign that Israel is conducting in Syria. And we see more and more indication that also Hezbollah and the Iranians are very unpleased from the things that are going on in Syria as well. And I think that the tension is high, and I think a lot is dependent on what will happen in Vienna. I think if the sides return back to an agreement, I think they will diffuse a little bit the tension. But if there will be some sort of collapse of the discussions and the U.S. will turn back full power to the maximum pressure campaign, I think the tension could lead to some sort of friction and even confrontation between Israel and Iran. And I just want to emphasize one important thing. It's not only Israel and Iran. It's what we call also the Israel and Iranian threat network, Shia, the Houthis from Yemen, the Iraqi Shiites, Hezbollah, and so forth. So if Israel found itself in escalation with Iran, it will find itself in escalation with the whole, what we call, axis of resistance.
Yeah. Brian, you've mentioned what's happening with Putin in Ukraine. You've mentioned China. Looking at the Biden administration that had many fantasies of maybe less international involvement, but it keeps dragging it back inside and probably later to the Middle East as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is how the way the world works, right? Both, I think, Donald Trump and Barack Obama in some ways wanted to pull back after George W. Bush was very much engaged in the Middle East and in other places. And certainly President Biden came into office with an awful situation. 4,000 people a day were dying in this country from the pandemic. We had a terrible economic situation. He actually did a decent job in his first year getting those things set in place. It's not perfect. And now I think what we see, at least on the Russia and Ukraine front, a very engaged U.S. that's rallying allies in Europe, though a lot of those allies and partners don't agree with each other or the U.S. all the time. I'd love to see that template put into place in the Middle East, because I actually think we have very capable partners that are now working with each other. But if you look carefully at the Biden administration and just its simple staffing, it's understaffed on the Middle East. A lot of the people that would be in place normally just aren't there. The people who are working on China and climate, those teams grew pretty quickly, and that sort of emphasis, the fact that it's thinly staffed, shows you that, in essence, the U.S. is still in this very reactive crisis management mode in the Middle East and not seizing a lot of the opportunities that are out there, including these normalization accords like the Abraham Accords.